For centuries, brilliant minds have been enthralled by the simple perfection of math. Geometry, numerical relationships, and other properties of numbers have long been the tools of charlatans and shaman, but the significance of numbers has not gone unnoticed by the people who would control the world from behind the scenes either. Phi is an irrational number equal to 1.61, etc. to infinity, and is represented usually by the lowercase Greek letter phi. As a ratio, it turns up in a number of unusual places, normally in spirals such as our own galaxy. If we plot out the spiral, the resulting radii tend to roughly correlate to a ratio each from the previous of 1.6 to 2. This same spiral pattern seems to be present in the DNA of sea animals, and even as a repeating helix pattern in other natural things, such as a sunflower seed pod. It's also found in pyramids, from the Mayans to the Egyptians, and continues to be used today. Briefly, in the isosceles triangle from the slope to the center vertices, it is the ratio between the slope to the vertices plus half the base. Interestingly, if we consider only that right triangle and mirror it to form a rectangle, we wind up with a golden rectangle. This rectangle is considered aesthetically perfect, as it has the fascinating property of repeating its own ratio if we calculate a square from any of the longer sides. In fact, it repeats infinitely to form a spiral that follows the golden ratio. The square is also significant in Pythagorean sacred geometry as one of the fundamental perfect shapes. It's renowned for its stability, simplicity, and mathematical perfection. The other basic Pythagorean shape is the circle, which also has a close relationship with an irrational number, pi. Pi is also concerned with ratios in that the diameter, or twice the radius, is always the same ratio to the circumference, 1 to 3.14159, etc. The radius, in case you don't know, is the length from the center to any point on the circumference. For these reasons, the square and circle are the basic building blocks for any sacred geometry. Leonardo da Vinci's Vitruvian Man is designed to show the relationship of the human body to the golden ratio. Additionally, it's placed on a background demonstrating the two most basic forms of sacred geometry, the circle and the square. The fingertips of Vitruvian Man touch the sides of the square at the point where the line below the fingertips is at the golden mean ratio to the total length of the line. In other words, if the length of the square's base to the fingertips is equal to 1.6, then the total length of the side of the square is equal to 2. That's the golden mean, a ratio of 1.6 to 2. Now, if we remove the figure, and if we mirror the golden ratio from the top down, something interesting begins to occur. By drawing a set of parallel lines connecting the points, we create a rectangle, but not just any rectangle. It's a golden rectangle, where if the shorter sides equal 1, then the longer side will equal 1.6. The next interesting thing we find is that if we draw two equilateral triangles from the lines we just placed in the figure, we get a perfect Star of David. Continuing with this path, if we next use the same starting line, the line from where Vitruvian Man's fingertips touch the sides of the square, and if we use it as the horizontal line in a pentagram, we find that the pentagram rests perfectly on the same baseline as the Star of David. However, neither the Star of David nor the pentagram are sacred geometric shapes in the true sense. A circle represents one side, a triangle represents 3, a square represents 4. To continue, we need a pentagon and a hexagon. This is what I'm going to call the sacred geometric mandala. Now, turning from geometry to geography for a moment, I noticed something very interesting a few years back. On our continent are 3 very striking and well-known minaret-like obelisks. The first is the Space Needle in Seattle, which interestingly enough was built in 1962 by the Pentagram Corporation. The second is the Canadian National Tower, which was the tallest structure in the world when it was built in the mid-70s. These 2 points are roughly 2,000 miles apart as the crow flies. The third minaret-like obelisk is the Stratosphere in Las Vegas, Nevada, which was completed in 1996. If we complete a downward-pointing equilateral triangle from the line connecting Toronto and Seattle, we find that it passes very closely to Las Vegas. This will become more interesting momentarily. The interesting thing about this triangle is that while it is not oriented to true north, a line bisecting the triangle would roughly point to magnetic north. So, if we adjust the map accordingly and pan out for a more inclusive view, then locate Las Vegas and overlay the rest of the golden ratio mandala, we see that even Las Vegas fits snugly into an intersection on the pattern. But if this is supposed to tell us something about a particular point on the map, it would probably be the point at the heart of the only sacred geometric figure which sits akimbo from the rest of the shapes. That would be the center of the circle, North Platte, Nebraska. The territory of Nebraska was carved from the Kansas Territory in 1854 by a congressional edict known as the Kansas-Nebraska Act. Nebraska was settled largely as a result of the Homestead Act, which was signed into law by President Abraham Lincoln in 1862. The territory was admitted into the Union in 1867, although then President Andrew Johnson initially vetoed that legislation. For some reason, Johnson wanted Nebraska to remain outside the jurisdiction of the federal government. Also during his term, several amendments were written complicating the Homestead Act in the new state of Nebraska and making it possible for the federal government to seize homesteaded land. However, only one person was ever sued by the federal government under any of these provisos, and he resided in North Platte. But for now, let us turn our attention to the southern hemisphere and return our focus to the minaret-like obelisks. Several such landmarks exist in the east as well in the lands down under. There's the Oriental Pearl Tower in Shanghai, China, as well as the Macau Tower in, where else, Macau. Continuing south, in Malaysia we find the KL Tower in Kuala Lumpur. Further south, on Australia's east coast, we find the Sydney Tower, and not far away on the same continent, we find Auckland's Sky Tower on the North Island of New Zealand. These 5 locations span more than 5,000 miles at their furthest points, but what seems particularly non-coincidental is that the 3 points in Asia, Kuala Lumpur, Macau, and Shanghai, are almost perfectly aligned. If we next draw a line from Shanghai to Auckland, we see that the line has quite a bit of a bow to it due to the curvature of the planet. A line from Kuala Lumpur to Sydney is equally warped. However, once we continue the lines to see where they intersect, we have a very distinct scalene triangle. It's a triangle we saw before on the sacred geometric mandala at the point where Las Vegas intersected with one of the intersections on the mandala. However, we've used that triangle once, and the same shape at the same inclination appears at another point on the mandala as well. And this time it's much closer to the geometric center of the circle. Once we rotate the mandala to compensate for the fact that we are in the southern hemisphere, we can determine the spot we are looking for as it relates to the scalene triangle. When we then transpose this to the map and compensate for the spherical nature of the planet and the fact that we are dealing with the more watery portion of our Earth, we can determine that the closest land to our reference point is in Papua New Guinea, specifically on an island once called New Ireland.